We're going to start with that top-line question of where is the money going in this coming year? What changes the people on this panel have seen in terms of allocation and spend? Let me start just by asking everybody to self-introduce. Start with Jonathan.
Hey, good morning. Jonathan Adams. I'm one of the leaders at Wavemaker, which is a new agency created by the merger of Maxis and MEC. Glad to be here. I look after a portfolio of businesses from travel to retail to financial services and others.
Sarah?
Hi, good morning. I'm Sarah Baehr. I'm with Horizon Media, and I run part of the investment group at Horizon.
I'm Vincent Letang. I'm EVP Head of Global Market Intelligence at MAGNA. And since Joe earlier mentioned Bob Cohen, for those who know him, I guess that would make me the grandson of Bob Cohen.
The grandson of Bob Cohen.
Professionally.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lou Paskalis. I am the Customer Engagement and Media Investment Executive for Bank of America.
So we have a major holding company, one of the largest indie agencies, major researcher, and a brand here. I'm going to start with Vincent, since MAGNA has come out with a major forecast for the coming year. Just set us up with at least MAGNA's view, and we'll just sort of use that as a table setter and then talk about more particularly how each of these is seeing their budgets move.
All right, sure.
Let's bring up our slide that we have that sort of gives an overview of MAGNA's view of the coming year.
So I'm going to try to give you the geist of our December forecasts in 5 minutes. We update them every quarter, and the most recent were published at the beginning of December. So the overall macroeconomic environment looks spotless. As you know, low unemployment, 10-year high consumer confidence. Real GDP is expected to grow by 2.5% this year, slightly stronger than last year's 2.2%. And perhaps most importantly for us, personal consumption is expected to remain at around 4%. This is important because this is statistically a good predictor of consumer spending and marketing expenditure. So it's all there. But in that environment, as you mentioned, we are anticipating net media owner advertising sales to grow by 5% in 2018. However, this is a year with Winter Olympics, FIFA World Cup, and midterm elections. If we strip out, if we neutralize the effect of those cyclical events, the overall all media market growth would be 3.2%, which is in fact a slowdown on 2017 and 2016. 2017 was 3.9%. So it's a moderate slowdown if we strip out the cyclical drivers. What else do I have to say? Yeah, in this almost spotless macroeconomic environment, one would expect advertising spending to be actually more dynamic than it is. And we think the reason for that paradox is that there are, in fact, many big advertising verticals, spending verticals, that happen to be struggling or saturated at the moment. And I think you can guess which one I have in mind. Automotive would be in the saturated list. Car sales are plateauing at a very high level historically, but still plateauing, and we've seen last year that manufacturers and dealers disproportionately cut marketing spend when sales are not growing. And then we have food, drinks, personal care, CPG, and I would add to that list, let me see, I would add entertainment and QSR. Those categories are struggling, despite the fact that the macroeconomic environment is good. These heavy advertising spending categories are struggling, and therefore saving on marketing expenditure to concentrate on the bottom line. We have only 2 or 3 big verticals that are on the other side expected to grow spending in 2018, and that would be pharmaceutical and finance being the main one. you've noticed that all of the struggling categories are actually heavy television categories, and that explains why national television will be disproportionately affected by the slowdown in 2018. The pricing remains strong, 10% CPM inflation, but that's not going to be quite enough to offset the decline in ratings. And we suspect some brands and products start to be actually priced out from national television. So as a result, we think national TV net advertising sales will decline by 1.5% in 2018. That would be -3 for English and Spanish broadcast networks, about flat for cable networks. And that would be, by the way, without the cyclical effects. If we put the cyclical effects back in, and the Winter Olympics is always a bonanza for national TV, it's going to be about flat. But flat on an Olympic year, that's not a fantastic performance.
So the shifting dollars that you're seeing here have more to do with, have less to do with the systemic shift from traditional to digital than it has to do with struggling categories that are heavy on TV.
Well, it's a bit of both, because if you take all traditional offline media ad sales, they're going to be down 4% this year, while digital ad sales will be up 12%. So the 5% I mentioned is actually -4 for traditional and +12 for digital. So, and within digital, to finish on that, we see search growing double-digit again by about 12%, while the fastest growing segments will again be video and social, both growing by about 25%.
Let's drill into some of the specifics and talk from the agency perspective. Let's start with Jonathan and Sarah, and what you're actually seeing in terms of shifts in allocation, changes in budgeting, and maybe changes in thinking about budgeting for the coming year.
Yeah, so interesting hearing the numbers from MAGNA, because they do make sense given what we're seeing. I think I was thinking about this question before the panel. There are sort of three types of clients that sort of, their allocation sort of makes sense in what we're talking about today. The first is sort of the data-driven client. And the data-driven client is just discovering a DMP, is just finding ways to leverage their audience data, and they are doubling down, and we're seeing massive increases. We're seeing increases in digital and targeting. And so we'll talk more about this in later questions. Those brands are still using linear media. They're still using traditional channels, but they are obsessing about ways they can target smarter and better. So we'll talk about this more later, but you're seeing increases in addressable and OTT via those clients first, because they have discovered their data and they're finding that way. And there are plenty of clients that just a year ago wanted to be in this space, but just were not there. I mean, ask Adobe, their business is growing like crazy, right? These are brands that are discovering their data. The second are the audience-driven clients. Very, very similar, the same idea, which is that they are finding their audiences where they can, and they're willing to pay the premium to reach them. We're seeing that play out, again, heavy increases in digital. But frankly, those audiences are being met through the funnel. And so we're seeing increases in places where those audiences can be engaged. We're actually seeing increases in print again in some places. We're seeing increases in broadcast, but more niche, again, cable, clearly to your point before. And then finally, the last audience segment I was going to talk about are those clients, rather, that are experiential in nature, retail, local, that require a chance to draw people in. And in those clients, we're seeing a rebirth really around out-of-home and bringing those clients, digital out-of-home, great, but really we're talking about bringing brands to life in markets. And I think that's something that I don't know if I saw a couple years ago coming, but now we're doing a lot of local activation, again, for those brands. And again, that plays nicely to digital too. We're seeing plenty of mobile and that mobile data making local media make more sense. But I think that the out-of-home and experiential has been interesting for those brands that have that need.
Sarah? Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the biggest things we experience is what does digital versus linear really mean in a mix, and what's actually contributing to media spend. And I think that where media spend, where our clients are getting their messages out are in many different places, not just us taking in a commercial, a banner, a native ad, or whatever it is, search, and placing it into the marketplace. I think the investment in content is something that, and how they're integrating themselves into messaging has shifted a bit, and that's really a reflection of trying to, to Jonathan's point about experiential. How do you become part of someone's conversation? How do you become part of something they're watching? How do you not just be an interruption? And I think that has fundamentally made it a little bit more difficult to understand, digital versus linear versus other, and how do we forecast for that? I do think that overall, search is something that continues to be that thing that very consistently allows us to connect the dots in terms of how media impacts each other. And there is a lot of gray area in terms of how Facebook fits into this, what is YouTube going to continue to be in terms of content and brands. There's so many factors that play into it and how we allocate the media. For Horizon, video overall is a really kind of almost disproportionate part of how we go to market, and how we think about that holistically becomes complicated by how much people are watching on non-traditional channels, whether it's mobile, and how we look at that, and the different types of mobile video, and what's actually video. Is it an animated GIF video now? So there's a lot of different things that we're struggling in terms of really understanding how do you kind of very neatly cut up media so that you can look at forecasts.
Is search sort of renascent, at least in terms of reliability, or the people going back to it in part because of some of the struggles that social's having in terms of reputation?
I don't know that I would fundamentally put it against as versus social, as much as that it is that thing that ultimately drives someone to an action. It's very intent driven. There's something behind that action. Whether it's a branded search or a general search, I mean my limitations in terms of search expertise are well known to me, so I won't go too deep. But what I do think is that there's correlations between media, and search tends to be that barometer by which you can see the interactions of other media.
Just tossing on top of that, it's funny because search is expanding. There are more and more brands getting into what we consider to be the search space. And there's, I think there's a piece just this week in MediaPost about Amazon getting into the search space. There are a variety of brands that are getting into this space now that we do business with, and frankly, that's really, really good. I mean, following consumer intent is the way to go. And so when we look at search, it has always been, generally speaking, where you put your first dollar. And so, and you saturate it till you really shouldn't spend in that space anymore, and then you keep going, because it continues to be a very, very strong play for us.
Lou, let's bring in the brand perspective in terms of allocation, changes in budgeting, and the ways in which you're looking at the media market.
I think I'm going to take a different tack. I think the driver of what Vincent's seeing isn't the puts and calls between various channels within media. I think we have a systemic problem overall that is a sort of three-headed hydra, which is going to be, I'm surprised that investments are down as little as they are in some of these channels. And I think that you're going to see a complete, as you described it, paradox between the economy and the media industry spend over the next several years if we don't take on this three-headed hydra, which is an attribution problem, a contribution problem, and a hygiene problem. Attribution has several facets. How are we dealing with fractional attribution across multiple touch points, particularly in an environment where nearly half of our impressions served in digital are in walled gardens, where we get aggregate data and things that don't add up in an apples-to-apples way with what we do in other environments, and we are seeing rapid growth in those walled garden platforms. We also have this sort of tectonic shift in our industry from an aggregate default model, which was one-to-many, to an opportunity to move to a new model, which is one-to-one. And I know a lot of people in my company that are caught up in that conversation because the aggregate model makes sense to me and it's relatively easy math, and the deterministic model is really hard, and wow, I got to think about customer lifetime value instead of did this ad drive a transaction. which gets me to the second bucket, which is contribution. The ROI on advertising is something that clients need to really start to discuss and debate and start to have a different kind of conversation with their agencies, because my thesis is it's not ROI, it's ROR. You're moving to a relationship model where we're taking CRM-like math and applying investments you can make, and as a result, I think you're going to see money come out of the industry and go into things like property, plant, and equipment, go into things like sales training, go into other things. This is not moving stuff from digital to TV or vice versa. I think we as an industry need to get our stuff together and really start to focus on this three-headed hydra before it kills us.
Okay, so Lou, as he always does, give us a lot to chew on. Let me throw it back to Sarah and Jonathan. ROI, how are we calculating ROI? Is Lou right, we're moving towards something closer to an ROR model? And how does that change things for you? Are we in a position to stem some of this tide that Lou suspects is out there?
Well, there was a lot. What I was thinking about as Lou was talking is that there is a little bit of a challenge when it comes to agencies and marketers looking at media, placing media as a means of fixing business. And I think that that's a little bit where you get caught between a hard place rock, whatever, use your analogy of choice. But because it doesn't matter how well you place media and how much money you pour into the marketplace if some of the fundamentals of your business don't exist. And I think that agencies have gotten slightly, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be contributing and that we shouldn't be thinking about business, and we should always, we work at the behest of our clients in terms of driving their business. But I think that there has become this idea that media is this thing that's going to turn business around. And I do believe that if you don't really take the time to really understand what your customers want and how they want to be messaged to and the products that mean something to them, that it doesn't matter what we do with media. I think that, yes, TV matters, the mix in how we use it in a smarter way to make sure that 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of delivering that message in an effective way is important. But it doesn't replace a product and a message and the operations behind it to deliver that in a meaningful way. It just becomes an excuse and a Band-Aid for something that may be more systemic than just getting a 30-second spot in front of someone in the Super Bowl.
Go ahead.
Great point. I think having said it's the brands play a role in an equal part in our success. I think it's a really, really, really smart point. Building on that, if you think back to Lou's contribution, attribution, hygiene. Just contribution for a second. So those, I'd highlighted, many of our clients we would consider the data clients, the clients that are obsessing about data right now. One of the tools that they are leaning on is media mix modeling, of course, and there's nothing new about MMM, right? However, today it's more important than ever. Understanding multi-touch attribution, to Lou's point, what role each channel plays, because too much credit maybe has been given to channels like search for a long time now. And while we still believe maybe that first dollar goes to search, as I said a few minutes ago, the reality is that maybe your second dollar might be in print, because you don't know how you're going to build that relationship with a customer. And understanding the MTA and then understanding the role of each channel in that does really change your view. We're going through that right now with several of our clients, helping them understand that the linear channels are playing bigger roles than they thought as they shifted so much money to digital. And maybe that makes sense, but the truth is there is a resurgence and appreciation for the roles the other channels have been playing. And again, sort of the orchestra of bringing those all together. I'm going to skip over contribution and go to hygiene. I think as an industry, we have really struggled around, sort of doing our own, counting our own, grading our own homework, and frankly, working together to solve the problems that have really troubled marketers. That issue is not going to go away. With complexity comes complexity. And so we are delighted to fix as many as we can uncover. And I don't mean to speak for an industry, but I know for myself, as I explain the concerns my clients have about partners and channels and our industry, the reality is we will uncover more challenges. And so we have to focus on anti-fraud. We have to focus on brand, frankly, viewability. We're really proud at GroupM that we have helped set the standard for what viewability and fraud standards should look like in our space, and we make sure that every ad we buy is viewable, seen by a person in the right environment, and so on. So that's something that we're really proud of at GroupM, but I do agree that it is a massive systemic issue that we all need to pay attention to.
I don't know if I'm pushing back on you, Lou, or extending your argument, but is this really a math problem? Is this a problem that's solved by attribution, by contribution? Or what you're describing is more existential one, that maybe explains why a P&G could take $100+ million out of digital and find that its sales actually went up, that search is becoming in vogue again as something that we want to go to. Or as you described, you're finding among, at least certainly among the category of retail, experiential and local is back in vogue, and there's a lot of pressure. Is that it's really an existential crisis about advertising itself, about whether it works.
I believe it is, and I believe what Mark Pritchard is doing is going to happen in more and more places. Kevin Eriks at Uber reduced his spending on search by 50%, and he spends a lot every week on search, and uncovered massive, massive click fraud, and was able to essentially deal with that and reduce his spending by about half and maintain his volume of app downloads, right? And so he presented those. I'm chairman of the MMA North American board. He presented to my board a couple weeks ago, and my jaw dropped. And so here's someone who can take half their dollars out of the marketplace and still drive their business. Pritchard's taken $100 million out. These stories eventually get to the management team. They eventually get to the board, and it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so we have to do some things. And look, I think clients are very culpable here. We have interesting conversations often with our agency, which are along the lines of cost. And in many cases, we have procurement functions which are entirely focused on cost. And I don't think we have the same level of rigor around value and what we're trying to do, and quality engagement. And so we tend to, it's like going into the operating room or going into the recovery room when you've got a family member who was just operated on, and the doctor starts talking to you about pulse ox. I don't know what the hell that is, right? No, the doctor talks to you about, hey, you know what, your relative is getting better, we think she'll be on the mend in a couple of days, and here are some steps you need to take. We're not having the right conversation with the agencies. We're down here talking about cost, and we should be talking about outcomes, and we should be empowering them to be stewards for us in these conversations about a better ecosystem. And instead, I just don't know enough of us are really pushing the conversation away from the sort of over-commoditization which has allowed this to happen. And the other thing that we've got to deal with, and this one is very hard, is the ad tech proliferation. There's too much ad tech in the stack that is eating 30, 40, 50, 60% of programmatic ad dollars, and a lot of it is redundant, and some of it is pernicious. And we've got to dig into that too, because those are all dollars that are going away from publishers, and not to cross over here, but this is probably a good time for us to be spending a lot to support quality journalism. And, thank you. Let's find a way to get the dollars to go to the quality publishers so they can do the work to keep us, in good stead here. That's all I'm going to say.
I want to add, going for quality instead of low costs, at all costs, is music to our ears in the agencies, and this is exactly the conversation we want to have. Brands have their share of responsibility in where the digital media ecosystem has navigated, because for so many years it was the dominance of procurement and somewhat blind to everything else, some blind to what quality do I get, or they were perhaps aware of the certain level of opacity, but they didn't want to know as long as nominally the price was low. So totally concur with you on this.
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea that, and you said this earlier, about there has to be a long-term vision, and we are often caught up in this kind of short-term game, whether it's a cost per something or a delivery or a viewability number, and those two things don't necessarily correlate with each other. And it's like many things, it's like you have to be patient enough to get things to work. Like education isn't going to get fixed in a short-term election. It's something that people have to invest in, and hopefully you'll see something in 20 years, right? But if we're constantly looking at how do I what's the next 3 months, what's the next quarter, what's my next earnings report, like with many publishers of content, they're struggling because they're being held accountable, for earnings. And they are making short-term decisions to make sure they can get to the next quarter versus being able to invest in evolving what the product is. And I think that is also something that, we as agencies tend to have to chase.
Okay, but at the same time that we have this nice conversation about the move towards quality, supporting good journalism, all of that stuff. Investments are growing exponentially in data. Data is still driving this, and that's where most of the budgets are growing fastest. Why don't you tell us all a little bit about, in practical terms, how much data is driving all of this, and how much it's sort of the system itself is driving us towards these performance metrics and this performance model, and how we pull back from that. So tell us a little bit about how data is driving your decisions this coming year.
I kind of see data as a blessing in many ways, but a big curse in other ways. And that is simply because there is never a meeting that I have where someone comes in and says, I don't have data for you. Everybody has some form of data, and no one comes in saying, we have really bad data for you to use. You end up having to pull into a much different skill set in understanding what is the media that I'm getting and what is the value of the data. And that's just kind of an evolution of a need for talent, definitely. But that data conversation has, I think, to me, become more and more of a struggle to really understand what is good data and what is too much data, and what is the data that my clients have that really make a difference, and trying to pull that together in a meaningful way, and then having the ad stack that's not redundant, that's not, potentially not filtering out some of the bad stuff. And that, to me, is the struggle with data right now, is that there's almost too much of it, and we don't know when there's too much of it. Many of our clients don't know how to use their first-party data, but when they do have it, how valuable is it, and how should we be using it? And then third, it's the technology behind using that in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah, sorry, there was a great trend coming out of, I guess, CES last year, which we were talking about it quite a bit, which is this idea that there was data overload. So when we came out of the sort of this season last year this time, we were talking a lot about how brands were sort of on this race to get as much data as they could, right? This big data, got to have it, and even the last couple years. And the reality, of course, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase already, is not big data, but the right data. And so for us, it's and for all of us, I'm sure, it's understanding how to start with the client's data about their customers, and in fact their best customers and their best prospects, and then use that to be smarter about our next dollar and next dollar. So one of the things we did in the last couple of years at Wavemaker and previous MEC is we have a study called Momentum. And our Momentum study is a global study of consumers and around the customer decision journey, around the CDJ. Just to understand that exact thing. Who is a prospect? Who's a missed opportunity? Who is someone who understands our brand and loves our brand? Who's already a converted customer? Again, understanding how to prioritize those investments by customer, and then help our clients use their own audience data, their own brand, their own customer data, CRM data, to then classify customers more intelligently and then target differently. So that, again, it's just like helping, for me, it's helped me reset how I think about the journey and also think about the data we're sitting on, because it helped us classify what we say to whom and when.
Yeah, so I can sort of echo what you guys are saying from inside the client. More than half of my time is spent working on data and technology inside the company. The two people I talk to the most inside of Bank of America are the Chief Analytics Officer and the Chief Technology Officer. My teams are engaged in uniting first and third party data at scale in a real-time model, and it's hard, right? First of all, you've got the data quality issue, which is like, you know, it's like Scarface in the 1980s. How much baby powder is in the cocaine? How bad is the data? How many times has it been stepped on? Sorry, it's a dated analogy. It was a movie, trust me, your parents watched it. So, you know, but you know, the internal data people who come to work in lab coats, they're like, we don't want that stinking third-party data. It's bad, and so you've got to get that cleaned up. Then your ad tech and your martech don't want to work together, and they're trying to do the same thing, and so you have to figure out an orchestration schema to manage one conversation in a privacy policy compliant, anonymized way in both first and third-party space for people who are logged in and not logged in, so that we can ensure we know where we are in that conversation. That requires significant technology investment. That requires understanding, you know, your decision-making rules environment, and it understands, you know, under modeling. All of that is pulling my focus inward to something I think is more sustainable and will be the highway for relationship. At the same time, though, it's less time with the vendor community. It's less time fighting for the hygiene. It's less time on, you know. So we need to figure out how to sort of divide and conquer in a thought leadership, because if the third-party data ecosystem continues to be crappy, it's going to be very hard for people to build high-fidelity systems to really orchestrate every interaction in a real-time environment.
Do those, I'm still trying to figure out how the two parts of that vision fit together, particularly how the data is driving massive amounts of targeting, maybe over-targeting, and that may be one of the problems, is that we're over-targeting and we're not entirely sure what we're going to do with that granular customer at the end of their individual journey when we get them, or we even have the resources to know what to say.
Why do you think the data and the targeting are together? That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for personalization. I'm doing it for engagement. Targeting is one of those sort of important things to get right, especially if we're talking about high fidelity one-to-one. But I want to know when I get there what to talk about. I want to know when I get there what's important to you. We use this line at Bank of America. We want to engineer relevance into every interaction. That's getting the right data and having it appended to a single view of the customer so I can have the right conversation. Sure, it helps with targeting too, but that's not my prime motivator.
But that's where the market's been drawn. I mean, that's how the data's been sold, is hyper-targeting. Right person, right time, maybe right message, but we'll get to that. But that seems to me a really important shift, is thinking about data not in terms of its ability to target and segment so much as its ability to personalize. Do you guys pick up?
Yeah, okay. So, agree. I mean, again, the reality is that I think you were looking for us to dig in on are we over-targeting? Have we become so obsessed with reaching just that right person that we've missed the big picture, right? Our brands like our organizations like Procter pulling out because they have over-targeted to sell toilet tissue to people that are about to go to the restroom. And that's, you know, they can't do that. But
it's a great geofence. Geofence.
That would be, so it's geofence the restroom. So, but the reality is you think about, you know, there are brands that require, you know, much, much higher level awareness, that require brand love that infiltrates our, you know, sort of our ethos. And there are brands that have relevant and private moments. And targeting can be also about, you know, being meaningful in a quiet moment on a device, or, you know, when you have a free second. That's great targeting too. And I think it can be completely worth it if you're able to send the right message to the right person. But you know going in that is, as I like to say to my teams, those are the candles on the cake, right? There's a lot of cake there. We spend a lot of energy creating great desserts. But that said, it's all about thinking about those, when you use data to that level of targeting, you have to know what you're going to say. You have to be relevant in those moments, and it's completely worth it. But you can't pretend that that's the whole cake.
Sarah, go ahead.
I mean, I agree. This is we're a very agreeable panel. But, the idea is that it kind of comes back to like all of the media needs to work better together. I mean, there is a place for mass awareness, brand building, connecting the dots, being in the Super Bowl, and getting people aware. How you take that and actually translate that into something that, whether it's search, whether it's Facebook, whether it's a data-driven thing, is where I think we often kind of lose that value proposition. So then it's becoming TV's not effective, print's not effective, search isn't effective. And the fact is that it is really about figuring out what are those pieces. And Jonathan, you touched on attribution. And that really is understanding how are all of these things working together. And there's generally never one right answer to that, but it's generally not an either or. Because I think that, just to say that print doesn't work, that's like chopping your arm off to lose weight, right? That doesn't work. There's a layering effect of getting a person, you and all of us, to think about a brand differently, to care about a brand, to have brand love, favorability, any of those great things. And those things require more thought. And data doesn't do that unless you're looking at it collectively.
One of the guys on my team, I have a marketing technology team that essentially spends their day engaging with a technology team and more like sort of a client model where we're advocating what we want. And in one of our very early meetings, the guy on my team was trying to explain to one of the senior folks in technology the shift we were going after. And he used this analogy, and I think Sarah makes your point. He said, we're moving from a hunting mindset in how we use advertising to a cultivation mindset. And I really like that because that starts to say, we're going to grow and nurture an idea, maybe in mass advertising, and then we're going to find those people who were exposed to it, and we're going to continue to provide information and value and thought leadership around the topic until ultimately, there's a yield there. And as opposed to targeting, which is what we mostly have been doing in this business, which is throwing a spear and getting that customer and nailing them. This is moving from a hunting mindset to a cultivation mindset as we try to compete for attention. And I think that analogy is more true than false.
Well, I think there's a lot of frustration and confusion. Maybe it all stems from over-expectations about data. Because it's still new. And I think it should be expected that there is a learning curve, a painful one. I'm relatively optimistic that things will get better. In the meantime, it takes a lot of investment, and it's a very good point you made. It forces a lot of people to it distracts them from what is really important, i.e. the brands, because it's at the core of marketing and advertising. And these days, yes, instead of cultivating the brand, I like your analogy, we try to go hunting for the hyper-targeted target and the short-term sales.
Are there any good examples out there that any of you are working with that sort of demonstrate what Lou's pointing towards, this idea of ROR, of that deeper relationship with the data driving less targeting and more a richer relationship, a greater, more personalized experience? I mean, in some sense, we are all talking about that catchphrase now that's become popular of the customer experience, and part of behind that is going to be using the data to drive that. Do you have an example of where that's working for you?
So yeah, just a really timely one. So the World Economic Forum last week just finished up, and that is the Super Bowl of the financial services industry, and so we're exceptionally focused on that platform for many reasons, not just what we do on the ground there, but also the social heat coming off of it. And so we use it as an environment to essentially engage influencers, use data, whether it's Twitter data or network insights or some of the other, to find out what their topics of interest are, then cultivate a relationship with them that starts at Davos on a particular topic or set of topics, and continue to publish to them post Davos to demonstrate that we share their values, to demonstrate that we find value in the relationship, We know that that drives significant increase in favorability when there are a certain number, sort of proprietary, of high-value touches. And I can tell you that we've done a lot of research with our customers, and those that have the highest level of favorability have a 23% higher NIBIT than those that have the lowest favorability, and that's a multi-year study over tens and tens of thousands of customers. So if I can use the relationship based on a convening thought around Davos and climate change and continue to dialogue and drive favorability, I know that that favorability drives more business outcome. Whether that's incremental sales or more use of existing product, doesn't really matter. It's about really top-of-mind awareness, what we used to call at American Express, top-of-wallet effects, right? People want to do business with you. And if you think intuitively, that's the retail sales model. And what's funny about that is there are 80,000 tellers and 14,000 financial advisors at Bank of America who, when you walk into their environment, whether it's the retail bank or their office, the first thing they say was, hey, did Johnny get into that school? How do you like the new car? When are you and Susan taking that vacation? That's return on relationship, but they're not doing it because we've actually calculated the value of doing that. They're doing that because that's how the human psyche is wired. We want to have these things that we know about each other. We want to demonstrate interest in the things you're interested in. It's a signal that I care about you. We can do that in digital. We can measure the outcome. And when we do, we're actually investing in a long-term relationship instead of like selling toilet paper.
Before we're going to go to Q&A in a short while. Before we do, I want to sort of bring this back to media, and particularly some topical things, since we're MediaPost and we're a journalistic organization, and get some of your thoughts about some of the major developments that have been going on in the last year and how they're going to impact the coming year. The duopoly. Lou, you started us by talking about the walled gardens. There's obviously a tremendous amount of investment going in there, but they seem to be a source of also a frustration in terms of making that larger calculus. Talk about how you guys are seeing the duopoly, further and deeper investments in the duopoly, and how you see it evolving over the next year. Toss up.
Just talking about the two brands we're talking about first. From a Facebook perspective, I'm personally disappointed that that Live didn't take off more. I think the concept of Live in non-linear channels is going to continue to take off, and we see that roll out with how people behave. But we are continuing to spend with Facebook. They are a good partner. I think over the last 6 weeks, though, the algorithm change has really changed how we see the brand and how brands will engage in the environment, and certainly from an advertising perspective. And everybody I know is asking me for advice on how to deal with it. So we're developing POVs by the minute, by category. Google. Again, we talked many times today about how search continues to grow and that they should continue to expect that to be an important go-to place for us. But the reality is video continues to drive their story and will for us and our relationship with them. So I think for us, those two brands continue to play a big role, and assuming we can sort out how to continue to engage with Facebook in a big way, we probably will.
Do you guys anticipate that with the changes that Facebook just announced in terms of prioritizing personal posts over media posts, that changes the context at all for those of you advertising in that space?
My thought about Facebook prioritizing personal posts over anything else, in many ways, it's the right story, right? I mean, what Facebook doesn't want is a story saying like, no one spends any time on Facebook because there's no content about anything that means anything to me. The fundamental thing about Facebook that made it special was that you did actually connect with people you cared about. And so the fact that they have changed the conversation back to that's what we're refocusing the algorithm on is the right story. People go back there, they spend more time, they engage with the content, and then as a result, the content that does show up, people end up spending more time with. So, to me, the idea is really that the experience overall should be more quality. How that nets out for publishers and people who are creating content, those who create good content will continue to thrive on that platform. And Facebook continues to be a really important partner for us, for many of our clients, and I think that we are constantly trying to figure out what is the right mix of Facebook versus others, what's the right Facebook mix within Facebook. And then there's also the entire Google factor, which is, those two things living so separately become challenging because they are so big, and how do you connect the dots there in terms of understanding the total value prop. But again, I mean, to me, it's, search and YouTube are one piece of the puzzle. The thing that kind of underlines everything with Google for us, in what we're thinking a lot more about, is their tech stack. So we spend a ton of money with DoubleClick, and with and DBM to a certain extent, and suddenly there's that value proposition of being able to connect YouTube search, all of your ad serving, all of that is something that starts to take you towards that idea of understanding what all of those digital touch points mean, because there is a single, in theory, you know this better than I do, and hopefully can fix all of the mistakes that I've just made up along the way. But that idea is real. I mean, putting aside the media part, that tech part becomes something that's very interesting in kind of understanding the digital attribution piece.
So you made a good point when you stressed that search is more integrated to the rest of the digital ecosystem than it ever was, and it keeps innovating, and there are new tools, and it's now not growing in isolation, but in combination with other digital formats, and that's very interesting. That's opening up a lot of opportunities, and that's probably one of the reasons why it still grows double-digit after so many years, and why so many brands now are significantly increasing their search budgets, which until 2 or 3 years ago was sometimes very small. As you know, to this day, search is very much a small, local, direct business thing, but big brands are coming to search because there are new opportunities. About video, you may remember that MAGNA pioneered a deal with YouTube back in 2016. Now at the time it was the first of its kind, and the interesting thing really was that it was pretty similar to the big upfront deals we've been doing for decades with television networks. A commitment on volume against a guarantee on price and on quality. So that's interesting that digital video also gets transacted alongside similar methods now.
Lou, you seem more ambivalent about the walled gardens at the beginning.
That was literally throwing chum in the water and saying, gee, they're going to be sharks. I'm in a very different place on the walled gardens. I think that I have to do business with them, but I don't want to do business with them. And that's not a good place to be, because I was like that with AOL and Yahoo and MSN in the day when they were the de facto centers of gravity. And, here's the thing. If you control half the market, and if you have the richest audience experience and the best data and the highest demand use for your products, why don't you want to share the data? What is it you don't want me to know? And I've had long conversations with folks at all these platforms. And, they have these reasons like, well, it could ire Congress to find out we were using the data with marketers to help you make more relevant offerings. And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to see if Congress could get united on something. I don't think it's going to be that. But, I just question the motivation as to why I can't have the data. So we do business with all of them. It may not surprise many of you, I'm all in on Twitter, because Twitter has certain superpowers that the other ones don't. Namely, it's a platform full of influencers. It's a platform that has immediacy to it when something happens in the culture, and that gives you a context to start a conversation, like the Davos example I just gave. So I can join a thought in a moment and demonstrate relevance, and I can do that, in a way that the brand is a hero. And ultimately, demonstrate that, we have shared interest. The other platforms have, interesting things. I'm really excited about where Instagram is going. I've seen some real growth there. I think Snap has a very loyal user base. It is not the most user-friendly platform today as a marketer. And Facebook and Google, I really would like them to be more transparent with me, so I could feel better about the spending I'm making there.
Are any of the new combinations that are coming into the market, obviously Amazon is making more of a splash in advertising, but also the media combinations of AT&T and Time Warner, Verizon and Oath, they seem to be trying, and of course a whole bunch of consortia of major media that are trying to pool their resources. Are you seeing anything in the market that is going to challenge the duopoly in terms of offering you greater transparency, a greater alternative?
Well,
no. On the short answer is no. In the short term, in the short term, there's nothing that can really hit the duopoly. But the consolidation you've mentioned, we welcome them. And Oath, for instance, is interesting. It's good for us to be able to buy and plan across those assets. That being said, in terms of scale and volume, it's not going to change things significantly. I think Brian here told me we calculated that Oath accounts for maybe 3% of digital video viewing. So you see, it's not going to be a massive new player that would shift the market dynamic in the short term.
It's hard not to jump on the Amazon bandwagon, except today that they're, 1/20th, 1/25th of the size of where Google is. I mean, and or even half that for Facebook. So I mean, they're starting. I mean, they are where they are. They're at the beginning of their story from an advertising perspective, but it'd be impossible to count them out. They've had more data than most organizations we do any kind of business with for 20 years, and so. Frankly, ambitious and excited to see where they go, but again, they nervous about the monster we create.
If there's a sort of a greater emphasis or a return to search, Amazon should be a big winner in that. At least the stats show that something like half of product searches are actually starting in Amazon now because people are viewing it as a default search engine for.
And add voice to that. Yeah. Add voice to that. Echo. It's just going to go through the roof.
Yeah, I mean, just having some fun with search. I mean, last year, we like to say last year was sort of the year of voice, right? And we all bought an Alexa or a Google Home in our house. This year is supposed to be, at least we're going to see that the rise of visual recognition and visual search. Again, we thought Pinterest was going to be the rise of visual search, but the truth is we may actually be getting, a year from now, we may be talking about the fact that visual search is a real thing, and it's something we need to take seriously, and I think that would be awesome.
Well, one thing nobody mentioned was Hulu, Fox, Disney. I think if that comes together, and if Disney acquires either Sprint or it's Sprint or T-Mobile, I think it's going to be interesting. 5G is a fundamental game changer, and then when 5G happens, I do think AT&T, Verizon, and whoever owns Sprint and T-Mobile at that time are going to really challenge duopoly because they too have their hand on the pipe. And I think that the reason they're going vertical in content production and acquiring, Time Warner, what Verizon did with Go90, all of those experiments are ultimately going to give them content studios. The meter's going to move from time to bandwidth. And I think the mobile operators are going to be some serious challenge to the duopoly in a way that I think will benefit the ecosystem and create a little bit more balance.
That's an interesting note to hand off to Joe's panel.